Hello and welcome to Portfolio Matters Small Cap Discoveries with Mahad Ahmed, who has prepared a presentation on the UK listed palm oil manufacturer or palm oil grower, MP Evans. But before we get into it, I will read the disclaimer. Everything discussed during the Portfolio Matters podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. Listeners should be aware we'll be discussing securities that we own or have financial interest in. Please do your own research and consult a professional investment advisor before making any decisions regarding topics mentioned on the show. Full disclaimer can be found at the end. Okay, Ahmed, thank you very much for your hard work. Take it away.
So MP Evans, as an overview, I've put together the first slide. So at the moment, it's got a market cap as of yesterday, 501 million pounds with a PE ratio of 9.63, and a dividend yield of just over 5%.
Very good.
So overall, the company is a producer of sustainable Indonesian palm oil. And in terms of its business segments, I'll go over it obviously in a lot more detail as well. But overall, they have three strands essentially. Although interestingly, they said that their property development business in Malaysia isn't really a significant. It doesn't have an impact on a revenue, and it doesn't produce a revenue at the moment, I believe. So that they don't really include that in their accounts. Currently, they own 49,600 hectares of oil palm in Indonesia, while also managing 15,900 hectares on behalf of its scheme shareholders. And it also owns 6 oil palm mills, which are used for the processing of the fresh fruit. In terms of its performance highlights, 11% growth in the group's crop on average each year in the last decade, 23% rise in the palm oil hectarage, which now stands at 49,600 hectares. It's acquired more than 10,000 hectares in the last 2 years on top of that, to now stand at 4,900, to now stand at 49,600 hectares. There's also been a 14% increase in the smallholder scheme, and the hectarage attached to that, which is now 15,900 hectares.
So
And
can you just explain what the smallholder scheme is?
so essentially, it's almost like it's a scheme whereby they assist them with the training. They will assist them with actually setting up, and then they will get the crop at favorable prices.
Right.
So it's kind of
They're outsourcing it
yeah,
basically.
yeah, it's a kind of outsourcing method whereby they can get around certain rules because from what I understand, Indonesia has certain land restrictions on the amount of hectarage a foreign company can own, um,
Right.
which
Got it.
is which I believe they still can actually increase their hectarage by a lot more. But the scheme does allow for um, having to they can expand their milling capacity.
Right.
So what happens is sometimes they don't produce enough fruit for the amount that the mills can take.
Right.
So they will buy it in at favorable prices so they can
Great.
increase the efficiency. So in terms of the price history of the commodity, palm oil, and this is specifically crude palm oil, which is different because with the palm oil fruit, you've got the fruit itself, and then on the inside, you've got the actual nut, and the nut produces its own oil called kernel palm oil. And the uses can vary slightly in that the fruit is used for more human, it's used in foods more,
Right.
whereas the kernel is used for soaps and the like and makeups.
Right.
So
Okay.
So in terms of the recent spike, it looks like that it's related to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So in terms of the alternatives, you have a couple of them, but the one that seems to have caused a spike is the rise in the price of this sunflower oil, which the two largest producers are Russia and Ukraine.
Right.
And so obviously with the war that has it was actually raging 8 years before that, but the full scale invasion that occurred in
Mm,
2022 seems to have caused the spike.
yeah.
Um,
So I saw that spike
yeah.
and I wondered whether that was just the price of oil spiking
Mm,
and the sub palm oil is being used to make biodiesel, but you're saying that's not right, that it's
mm.
actually sunflower oil.
I think it is a combination of factors. There is an increase in what they call a biofuel mandates, uh,
Right.
and countries are trying to increase the amount that the biofuels make in their uh, energy supply. So that also has an impact, and of course, it is a very cost-effective vegetable
Mhm.
oil.
Yeah.
So, but I think also, of course, when the price also goes up for one oil, in particular in poorer countries where palm oil is used as a cooking oil often,
Mhm.
um, those price sensitive markets often feel the shift a lot quicker. Um, and also, it's we're going to get into it, but it's a very geographically concentrated um, oil in its production. So when Indonesia, I think in 2022, they temporarily also had an export restriction,
Mhm.
which has also caused the price to rise. And it has come back down, but it does seem that there is a level that there is now more of a price, there is a higher price floor than there was before. So share price history, it's a commodity, so often it will, as good as the management is, as good as
Mm.
the production is, often the the price of the share will be very closely linked to the price of the commodity. Uh,
Well, the share price has done well because the
yeah.
London market has done nothing over the last 10 years
Mm,
and share price of MP Evans has doubled. So
yeah.
good.
In terms of the overview, of the three strands of the business, the first one, oil palm plantation. So, as I said, the palm fruit is separated into two parts. You've got the crude palm oil, and that's the price that was shown before, which is then crushed, um, and the oil is then refined and extracted. And then you've also got the kernel palm oil.
Mm.
And so, interestingly, you have to process the fruit within the first 24 hours if you want a high quality palm oil.
Mhm.
Um, and for every 10 tons of crude palm oil produced, you only receive 1 ton of kernel palm oil. So it's a lot more than the seed can produce, which
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. The products then undergo refining and fractionation, so it does mirror um, oil processing, so crude oil in that sense, where you can produce different grades of the oil depending on what you want to produce at the end of it. So if you want it for a soap manufacturing, if you want it for a cake
Mm.
and biscuits, it's going to be a bit different. Interestingly, most of the value created in palm oil production is actually captured by the palm plantations. So downstream, they don't make as much money from the actual
Mm.
commodity, which is
Okay.
interesting. In terms of the sales of the firm, crude palm oil actually made 87%, and the palm kernel made 9%. The fresh fruit bunches is a segment where they just sell the raw product. Uh,
Wow.
so that made up 4% of the firm's revenues last year. Currently, per ton, it costs around $427 to produce,
Mhm.
which is up by 6% due to fertilizer inflation, which is actually the highest cost
Yeah.
apart from labor, which obviously
Mm.
take from that what you will, but the current or the average for last year was $729 for uh, for a ton of crude palm oil.
Right.
Obviously, it's higher now, but that kind of gives you the
Mm,
kind of understanding of the margins. So I've included this bit because, of course, with plantations, you want to see where a company sits, what's the profile of its assets. So in terms of the tree, interestingly, once if you plant the palm oil seed, it takes about 2 years to mature, but it can also take an extra 3 to 4 years before the tree begins producing fruit.
mhm.
But during this early phase, production is low, so the firm can't really rely on that tree. But it reaches its peak productivity by its seventh year, and it maintains this level, roughly maintains this a peak a production level until its 18th year, and it slowly starts to drop off. And around the 25th year, it's normal to start the replanting period. And oh, forgot to add. And the firm currently, the average age of its trees is around 11 years, which is better than uh, on the
Right.
London market. I know that the closest company is Anglo Eastern, which is around
Mm,
15, around
right.
15.
Okay.
So it is still within its peak period.
Mm,
In terms of oil extraction, that's where the mills come into play. So at the moment, it's been able to double its mill count from 2020 levels to six, with a market-leading oil extraction rate of 23.4, which is actually above the Indonesian average of 20. Um,
okay. Because I saw this, Ahmed, and I was thinking that's really interesting. But how are they doing it? Do you know
mm,
anything about the details of what? Because you would think this is not very high technology.
mm,
So how come their extraction rate is because Anglo Eastern is listed as well in London, and they've got an extraction rate of 2.5% higher. You know, that's
yeah,
10% basically.
yeah,
So
yeah.
what do you know what they're doing?
I'll be honest, no, no,
Right. Okay.
no. That's something that I think would be interesting to look into for sure. Um, but you do also have Sipef, which is a Belgian company, um, which also has quite a high
Yeah.
rate, although that company is more diversified in the kind of agricultural commodities that it produces. So it produces
Yeah.
tea,
Well,
bananas, and
well, it suggests MP Evans is actually very well run.
mm. So apart from the mills, it does also have a property development arm, which currently it has a 40% stake of a Malaysian property development with a land bank of 210 hectares. The group previously owned six oil palm estates in Malaysia, of which five have been sold off with the proceeds reinvested in
Yeah.
Indonesian palm oil assets. So it seems like they've used the money to buy more land in Indonesia for the.
Yeah, but that's odd.
Yeah, it is. I
There's
think it's one of the
there's that
unique.
go Malaysia, so I should declare that I'm half Malaysian at this point. So when I go and see relatives, I fly over these plantations.
Yeah.
And Malaysia is a very corrupt country, and
Mm,
it does make you wonder
mm,
whether they've had to do a deal of some kind in selling them to when they sold the palm estates in Malaysia, whether part of the deal was they had to invest in some property or something. But that's not great. This does not strike me as good diversification. They don't have any expertise in property.
But yeah, that's actually an interesting thing. It's very possible. Um, and interestingly, I believe they said that it produced no revenue for the year, um, which
Well, yeah, it's not great, but perhaps they got an offer of some kind on
yeah,
some of the land. Be worth looking into if anyone is thinking of investing to see exactly how that arose.
yeah. So in terms of the oil yields, so palm oil's advantages, this graph and there's a couple of other graphs, is quite interesting in terms of how much palm oil can be produced from 1 ton.
Wow.
Sorry, how much palm oil can be produced uh, per hectare per year,
Mm.
and it does really outstrip any competitor. of the
Yeah.
vegetable oils, which does explain why it's the most cost effective of the vegetable
Yeah.
oils. And
Because when you look at this, you think actually this is, you know, the the way you produce palm oil itself may not be very eco-friendly, frankly, but in terms of the efficiency of using the land, this is astonishingly effective.
it is,
Compared
yes.
to, growing sunflower seeds in the UK,
Yeah.
you get much better yield per hectare.
Yeah, you do. You do. That's very true. And I think they call it a sparing effect almost on the land,
Yeah.
whereby you leave off having to uh, develop some of the land because you can use less of it, but
Mm,
still get the same amount to fulfill the demand for vegetable oil. Um,
yeah.
you can feed, especially for poorer countries, where you can supply them with a cheap product, whilst also sparing some of the land from deforestation.
Yeah.
Um, So this is just more of a graphical example of the palm oil value chain. So at the top, you start off with the fruit, which then gets milled, and then you get the separation. And
Mhm.
on the one side, you get crushing, on the other side, you get fining. And then the end uses are also quite interesting because uh, it's quite obvious that one is more used for things that we would see day to day in our lives, and the other is maybe used for more industrial uses such as paint, grease, chemicals, and the livestock industry. Um, so quite a lot of us do have, whether we know it or not,
Yeah.
we've probably got palm oil in our cupboards. So yeah, this is just a more graphical show of the uses from the world in data, which have used the data from the UN the UN Food and Agricultural Organization to kind of just show how different the vegetables are in their land use and how that
Mm,
compares to how much you can produce from it. So this was theirs, and then I've produced a kind of a simpler version to look at in the bottom right corner. So just comparing each one to how much tons it can produce per hectare per year.
yeah.
And it is quite stark to look at
It is.
that it is very, very space efficient.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
when you think of the problems we're having in Europe with
Mm.
olive oil, and so droughts have really affected the olive oil crop.
Mhm.
Well, you get 10 times as much palm oil out of a hectare of land in Indonesia than you do out of an olive oil grove.
Yeah, yeah,
Amazing.
yeah, yeah. Especially when you look at the need for uh, urbanizations increasing in a lot of countries, and
Mhm.
there's less space, and cities are expanding, and there's a desire to kind of preserve the countryside all over the world.
Mm.
Just the ability to use less land for the same output is very interesting, and it does explain why the price is so low in terms of the actual cost in comparison to
Yeah.
each of the alternatives. Um, Interestingly, it was raised that as countries get richer, they do actually increase the per capita use of vegetable oil.
This is a really amazing chart
Oh,
because,
sorry.
so keep it there,
Yeah.
Mahad. This is a really amazing chart
Mm,
because, see, what we're saying is that Austria consumes 32 kilograms of
mm,
vegetable oil per
mm.
person per annum.
Yeah.
That's an absolutely astonishing number.
Yeah. It is very, very interesting. And it is quite stark when you put it into like a scatter plot like this. And you actually
Yeah,
see the trend is very, very clear. And this is actually one of the drivers that the people that are more clued up on the market than me actually say that as countries get richer with
yeah,
a crop like palm oil, at the moment, you have poorer countries use it more of as a vegetable oil that they use to
yeah,
cook with, which is probably a reason why a lot of people, apart from the environmental part, don't really understand palm oil. Whereas in poorer countries, whereas in the West, we use it more as a manufacturing it's used more for the manufacturing side. So we get to see the products that include it rather than actually the raw good. And they say that, of course, with increasing wealth, in these countries, they're going to want more and more manufactured goods.
Yeah.
And with this graph, it does really present an interesting.
Yeah. So actually, my earlier point about Austria is wrong because the biggest consumer is not Austria. Austria is the blue chop dot below the orange dot, which is North America. That must almost certainly be the US.
It is, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm pretty sure it is, yeah. US and Canada, I assume
Yeah.
would, yeah, yeah. It's a very stark
No, but
difference.
you make a very good point that, as the world gets richer, they, clearly use substantially more oil per head.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And a lot of that doesn't come from the actual consumption of the raw good, more the soaps and the cakes,
Right.
it's and the processed
Got you.
foods, for
Yeah.
example, as well. And
Okay.
yeah. So in terms of the growth, I think first you've got the expansion of the plantation areas and the ongoing land acquisitions. Of course, this will increase the amount of space that they can produce the palm oil in if they plant that land, that is. You've also got rising global demand. As you've seen from the previous graph, there is a strong correlation between rising living standards and I've said rising palm oil consumption as a part of vegetable oil consumption,
Mhm.
um, since it is the lowest producing, the lowest cost, uh, producing vegetable oil.
Mhm.
There is also strong structural demand for palm oil in foods, but not only foods. You've also got the biofuels and consumer goods outside of that, which is also driven by a rising world population, and that could, in the long term, provide a revenue driver for the firm, but also for the crude palm oil price. So also operational efficiency in terms of improvements in the yield. I think oil extraction rates currently can support consistent profit margin growth. Um,
Really? I mean, because the thing is, Mahad, when I looked at the chart earlier, which shows they have by far the best extraction rate,
Mhm.
you wonder how much further that can improve.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. I think I think in terms of the oil extraction rate, it'd be more if they can keep it steady. And on sustainability, I think the RSPO, which is the Round Table on Sustainable Palm Oil Certification, uh, positions MP Evans as a leader in sustainable palm oil. Um, and this will drive demand in sustainability, especially in sustainability conscious markets such as the EU,
Yeah.
which at the moment
So when you suggested this MP Evans as a subject,
Mhm.
I my initial reaction was palm oil bad. And
Yeah.
so I did a bit of a search on MP Evans and whether there was who was what activists were protesting about their plantations in Indonesia.
Mm,
And really there wasn't much actually.
mm,
And then, so I did some more digging, and there's MP Evans do seem to be really quite responsible. And
mm,
so they have this sustainability criteria where they won't plant and plant it. No, basically no plantations which are virgin forest, etc., etc.
mm.
And there's lots of criteria on the website, but they do
Yeah.
seem to take this very seriously.
Mm,
And as a result, there doesn't seem to be that much activist protests about MP Evans. They do seem to be quite responsible.
yeah. Yeah. I think of course it can also be the size of the company. It's not one of the big companies
Right.
the average Joe might know about. Um, it's not like a Unilever or a Nestle but yeah, it does seem that way, especially reading the annual report. So I think another point is also the biofuel boom. So at the moment there are increasing biofuel mandates. In Indonesia, they're trying to increase the palm oil content in their biodiesel to
Mm.
40%, which is expected to require an
Right.
extra 3 million tons of palm oil yearly. And
Right.
likewise, the EU's renewable energy targets support the blending of the biodiesel with conventional fuels,
Mm,
providing further emphasis to a demand. So they're trying to increase the biofuel. They haven't explicitly said palm oil, but of
mm.
course they also have restrictions on the sourcing of that palm oil, and they're
Yeah.
more conscious of where it comes from. In terms of its financials, from 2018 to 2023, revenue has grown from $109 to $307 million, which is a
Wow.
compounded annual growth rate of almost 20 million. While net income rose from 5.4 million dollars to $52.5 million dollars, which is a compounded annual growth rate of about 10%.
Wow.
Yeah, industry leading margins currently of 27.77%, which actually ranks second in the UK foods and tobacco industry group, uh,
Mm,
with ROE and ROC ranking in the top 20% of its peers, standing at 13.9% and 17% respectively. In terms of its solvency and its liquidity, net debt to equity stands at 1.5%, while its current ratio stands at 1.7, and the quick ratio stands at 1.42, with an interest coverage of 34.7. So financially, they seem to be stable.
right.
And of course, on the side, I've put the comparisons. So in terms
Yeah.
of what Stockopedia would rank them within their industry grouping is the dividend. Uh, a price history shows that the dividends per share have been rising. And the graph shows actually from the early 90s, but the firm has paid a dividend for the last 36 years consecutively, with
Fantastic.
dividends rising from 8.25 pence to 47.5 pence.
Wow.
Um, in the last 10 years, which I should have included in there, um, which is a compounded annual growth rate of 17.7%, with a current dividend yield of around 5%, um, which obviously changed perhaps
Mm,
since I put this together. Oh, and the dividend cover stands at above 2. So it seems that it can pay this dividend
yes.
sustainably. So I've done an intrinsic valuation. Of course, there is a stipulation this is a commodity stock, so its ability to control its profitability is always going to be linked to the price of the crude palm oil. Um, I'd love any feedback for anyone watching.
So hang on, because I saw this. Where do you get the terminal value from? What's that? How have you assigned it a terminal value of a billion?
um, so I've used the perpetuity growth model.
Okay, right, got you.
Yeah. So that gives it a discounted cash flow fair value of 17 $17.35, which the currency rate may have changed since I put this together. So
Yeah.
it stood at 13.75.
So what's the current share price, Mahad?
It currently stands at £9.49.
Okay, so that's you're talking about actually a 50%
Mhm.
rise to get to your estimation of its value according to the discounted cash flow analysis. If
Yeah,
you're interested, please take a look at the calculation in front of you, and Mahad will be on the Discord. So
yeah,
if anyone wants to get in touch, do so.
yeah. Also for comparison, Anglo Eastern seems to be undervalued in comparison to MP Evans. Although I think there are some factors around the company seems to have uh, a falling revenue in the last 2 years, which is a bit worrying, seeing as the crude oil price has risen, and its extraction rates are lower, but also the firm has lower margins. And interestingly, the age range or the age profile of its trees is older, which may be something that's being factored in.
Well, this would be an interest if you're interested, Mahad.
Yeah.
This would be something to follow up on because
Yes.
when you
Yeah.
look at Anglo Eastern.
Yeah.
Some of those numbers are very odd.
Yeah.
Earnings yield of 44.5,
Yeah.
but it's on a P ratio. Well, it's on a P ratio of 5.4, presumably because the earnings are so high.
Yeah.
But the return on capital employed is lower than MP Evans. Something those numbers don't add up. There's something odd going on there.
There is, and I was looking at ADVFN share chat
Yeah.
for the stock, and it seems that current shareholders also are a bit puzzled by it,
Mm,
which is a bit worrying. And also, I did do a DCF on that company, and it's
right.
to be uh, valued at around £19 per share,
Mhm.
which gives it a heavy. Um, it says that it's heavily discounted, which might be for good reason, because I'm always suspicious when a company's that heavily valued and undervalued. So, in terms of sustainability, Keith raised that um, this should probably be a piece that I should cover. So, in terms of the market, the alternatives are obviously going to use a lot more land if the yield is a lot lower, which, in terms of sustainability, it can mean that more land needs to be taken up for agricultural production than can be
Yeah.
left for conservation. And of course, in terms of shifts, you can say it shifts the problem to other parts of the world because palm oil is so heavily concentrated around Indonesia and Malaysia that,
Mm,
of course, if you were to produce in another country, if you were to produce a different commodity in another country, um, there would probably be the same kind of dynamics around
yeah.
land use and conservation.
Mm,
Um, this group called the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil was actually set up in 2004. It's currently got around 4,000 members from all corners of the market. So it tries to bring together the multinationals as well as the small the small holders and the
mm.
buyers, so companies like Unilever and Nestle. And currently, 20% of crude oil is sustainable. Um,
What
and
do you mean by that? So 20% of crude oil. What do you mean by?
sorry, crude palm oil
Okay.
is has been certified as sustainable.
So, and what does that mean?
I think that's something to look into further, um, because
Okay.
they've become the world certifier on
Right.
what's sustainable and what's not.
Okay. Got you.
Of course, when an institution has a lot of power, you don't know exactly sometimes how they're giving these certifications. It can be a bit murky, but that's something to look into for sure.
Mm,
Um, in terms of MP Evans, the company has reported that it's reduced its water use while also trying to improve its methane capture, which is a problem when the crop is actually going through the refining process, that it does release methane. Um, and currently, 5 out of the 6 mills have been equipped with the facilities to capture the methane.
mm,
Although these mills have actually doubled in number, so it does show that the company is quickly trying to include these facilities onto any new mills.
mm,
Currently, there's been a 19% drop in greenhouse gas emissions since they're producing more. They're processing more in-house, so obviously they don't have to transport it, and they're able to also better control how that processing takes place. They do have a zero deforestation policy, so they don't plant on a virgin land,
mhm.
and they also have a policy from 2018 of no new planting on a peat which has carbon capture
Yeah.
capabilities. Currently, 70%, 74% of the group's planted area is RSPO certified, and 66% of the scheme shareholder land is also RSPO certified.
Yeah. It's not 100%.
Not 100%, no. No.
Right.
And interestingly, this graph also does show how deforestation
Well,
does
that's good.
rise and then
Yeah.
fall.
Oh, well, that's great. Actually, that is not the picture I had been led to believe.
Yeah, yeah. So in terms of catalysts, I think if there are any supply shortages, disruptions in the palm oil production, could push the prices up, which could benefit the company. Of course, this could also harm the company
Mm.
if it were to be in the areas surrounding it. Of course, with the high levels of concentration, 80% of
Yeah.
the world's palm oil production is produced within two countries, namely Indonesia and Malaysia.
Mhm.
Um, any strategic M&A, so any acquisitions of, in particular, land, or if they were to expand their capabilities in the milling process, so as to become a miller as well as a producer of palm oil. And of course, there's in the London market, there's been a lot of takeovers recently.
Mhm.
And with the firm's financial footing, I could see it being acquired by um, a larger company as part of their operations to try
Mhm.
and shore up their own supply.
Yeah.
Um, Industry consolidation. So this is similar to the previous point, which would lead to an increased ability to put a downward pressure on prices for
Mm.
their inputs while charging the same for the outputs. And of course, also sustainability policies.
Mm.
Growing global support for sustainable palm oil could enhance demand, and the premium pricing that comes with
Yeah.
that certification,
Yeah.
which is understandable.
But it doesn't really need any catalysts because it's just a good, well-run company that's been steadily growing the dividend and steadily going production. I'm very impressed actually with the yield they get compared to their competitors. They clearly manage to both run the plantations well and get the most oil out of the fruit compared to their competitors.
Yeah, yeah. The risks, some of them are, well, actually, they're all obvious. The-
Actually, so rather than go through all the obvious dangers, Mahad, there's one I wanted to discuss, which
Mhm.
is that the a lot of the land they farm is leased, and those leases come up for renewal,
Mm,
and they are on quite long leases. I believe it's between 70 and 25 years.
mm,
But at some stage, those leases come up for renewal, and then the lease owner, the landowners, could demand much higher rents for leasing the land.
mm.
Using the land.
Yeah, that's definitely a risk. Um, and as well with the laws around land ownership, particularly in Indonesia, for it, especially being a foreign company, uh,
Yeah,
there are restrictions. So it means that they would have to definitely leverage the relationships they've built up to try and get the best outcome.
right. Okay.
Yeah. So apart from that, I'd say climate change, adverse
Mm,
weather conditions, pests and diseases,
yes.
fluctuations in the price, and any regulatory changes. So uh, Indonesia being a developing country, the government can be a bit less predictable, uh,
Mm.
especially in its relations with foreign countries.
So overall, so have you got a conclusion somewhere, a conclusion slide, I
Overall,
think?
I'd say it's an interesting market, an interesting commodity, um, and a well-run firm. Uh,
Yeah, it seems to be a very well-run firm, is what I'd say.
yeah.
I'm very impressed by their environmental stewardship, but number one is the dividend growth has been really extraordinary.
Mm,
So, reading online, it's the recommendation said a dull but solid company, but actually it's more than that. It may be not very interesting technologically wise, but it seems to be very well run, and actually they have a very strong financial history of delivering growing dividends, etc. So it looks good to me.
yeah, I think the dullness is maybe something that makes it overlooked. So yeah, yeah, it was
Great.
definitely something to come across.
Great. Okay. So I hope you all enjoyed that. Thank you very much to Mahad for doing all the research. If anyone else would like to research a company and present it on the channel, please get in touch. In the meantime, thank you very much to Mahad, and it's goodbye from Mahad and me, Keith Jordan. Goodbye.
Full disclaimer. The material and information contained in this podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon for making a business, legal or any other decision. We may own or have a financial interest in any securities mentioned. Listeners should conduct their own research or consult a professional investment advisor before making any decisions regarding topics mentioned on the show. Whilst we endeavour to ensure that the information presented on the show is correct, we make no representations or warranties of any kind, express or implied, with respect to the podcast and website or to any information, products, services or related graphics discussed or presented in the podcast or website. Any reliance you place on such material is strictly at your own risk. You are solely responsible for the investment decisions you make. We will not be responsible for any errors or omissions in the podcast or website, including in articles or postings, for hyperlinks embedded in messages, or for any results obtained from the use of such information. Nor will we be liable for any loss or damage, including consequential damages, if any, caused by a reader's reliance on any information provided by the podcast or website. Please do not listen to the podcast if you do not accept self-responsibility for your actions.